There we go. Welcome to another Bow of the Father. We're here in the dining room, of course, as always. Hopefully, maybe expand as time goes on and get more people. We'll see how that goes. So again, this is an open forum. For anyone who has a question, they're open to ask. Hopefully, I have an answer. And if I don't, I'll try to find one eventually. Um, so, floor is open.
I've got a question, and it seems that over the recent times, say in the last 6 months to a year, there's been more use of incense and chanting, both in English and in Latin, and increased in Latin in general.
Mhm.
And it's not just at this parish.
Yeah.
It's been because I've been to some masses outside of this archdiocese, and there have been questions about that at those places
Sure.
too.
Sure.
So is this a new focus from the church, or is it just something that's kind of come full circle again?
Yeah, I mean, maybe a little bit of both and. I mean, when we look at, these are the thing about with incense in Latin is that isn't new, right? I
No.
mean, so I think a lot of this, and here's the thing, I want to be very charitable in the way I kind of maybe critique these things because one thing I've always said is I think a lot of priests are products of the seminary they come from. And what I mean by that is, I think it's kind of interesting that the seminaries didn't actually have a overarching structure until 1997. So you think of like how many centuries people have been, priests have been trained in these seminaries, and that's where the university system came from, right? Obviously, these formation of clergy. But before 1997, there was like no like overarching like here's how we're going to do it, right? As a matter of fact, it wasn't until the Council of Trent in the 1530s that actually seminaries were kind of promoted as being something that should be done by every area, right?
Okay.
And um, so you flash forward 500 years later with John Paul II, and now he puts out this document called Pastoro Dabo Vobis, which means I will give you shepherd. Again, Latin, right? The document's already always in Latin, because Latin is the mother tongue of the church. And I think what happened specifically after Vatican II, there was this spirit that was kind of promoted, and not necessarily what was actually came out of Vatican II. So where this all comes from, so it's always good to kind of check down as far as why. First off, why can we do this? What is the rationale behind it? What is the purpose of it? And what is the actual explicit allowance for it, right? So the germ, for instance, so the germ is the general instruction of the Roman Missal. That calls for use of incense. Now, it doesn't say you have to use it, but a lot of things that came out of Vatican II is not necessarily things that were obligatory, but allowances. And so that's, I think, where a lot of this gets missed in some ways, right? So, like for instance, the governing document that came out of Vatican II, which then allowed the germ, which made the missal, and so on and so forth, was called Sacrosanctum Concilium. And again, the Latin term means this sacred council. That's all. So whenever you read these documents, it's always the first like few words of the first sentence that actually names the document, right? So Sacrosanctum Concilium was the document that kind of governed this new liturgy that came out of Vatican II. Now, what's I think very interesting about Sacrosanctum Concilium is that it doesn't really change anything. So, for instance, it several times it mentions in there that Latin is the mother tongue of the church and should be upheld and used within the liturgy. Several times it says chant is the most ancient form of worship in the liturgy and should be upheld. Even to the point where it says like the organ takes pride of place in liturgies, right? Now, again, it does allow that because maybe there's more modern structures that were built that don't necessarily accommodate an organ or these other things. So what that document said, there could be other allowances to be used that are properly oriented towards liturgy. And I think what happens sometimes after Vatican II is there was so much focus on these allowances that there wasn't necessarily a focus on the bulk and the traditions that the church was still upholding. It's actually kind of interesting in that same in the same documents of Vatican II when it talks about the Friday fast, the Friday abstain, right? A lot of people don't know that was never remitted. That was never like, done away with. What the council did was say, yeah, look, you should still maintain this abstinence, but if you perform some other form of penance, yeah, have a cheeseburger, right? I mean, I don't say that explicitly, of course, but what it says is, the Friday is such an important day in the week. It's when our Lord sacrificed himself for us. We should mimic that in some way. And maybe that's not necessarily an abstaining from meat, but maybe it's, I don't know, not flipping somebody off when they cut you off in traffic, right? So what the document kind of does is it allows you to be the arbiter of that, which is kind of funny because during Lent, we kind of do the same thing, don't we? When we give things up or like do things for Lent, it's funny when we get ready for Lent. I always tell like the kids and other people, it's like, we're not that far away right now. That when it comes to these Lenten practices, I'm not going to be over your shoulder like, hey, you said you're going to give up chocolates and it's Thursday. What are you doing? That's not my job. And nor would it necessarily be matter for confession because you're the arbiter of it. If you want to let yourself off the hook on a Thursday, or maybe it's just a really, really hard day, and you're like, you know what? I really need a piece of chocolate right now. That's up to you, right? So in the same way we talk about these Friday, penances, that's up to you too, right? But what happened was we don't have to meet. The focus was we don't have to meet on Friday now. So okay, all bets are off. When that's not what that's not what Vatican II really said. In the same way, when it comes to these things, I think again there's this focus on what's allowed rather than what are these traditions. So when we talk about Latin, for instance, I think what people focused on when it comes to the Sacrosanctum Concilium is that the council did allow for use of vernacular, but even gives the rationale behind that. Because it says, well, this is a little bit new, right? I mean, it's the same structure of the Mass has always been there. You're always going to have liturgy of the Word, you're always going to have liturgy of the Eucharist, you're going to have, the opening prayers and the Eucharistic prayer and all that. That's always been the case, even from the time of the first century, right? We see that in the writings of the apostles and also the writings of the patristics, right? It's always been that way. But how that comes about, well, the church does different things. And so because this is something relatively new, although many think that the Novus Ordo, we call the Novus Ordo, the new way, actually harkens back to the first house masses that were done in the first few centuries of Christianity.
And that's where they were usually done.
Correct. Or that, or like at graves. Because again, we have to understand right underground. Exactly right.
Temple,
yeah. These were being done in secret because if you were a Christian, you died, right? So house masses were a thing too. As a matter of fact, in the Holy Land, at Peter's house in Capernaum, there's a church there because this is when the Mass were being celebrated, right? But the focus there was on the vernacular because, well, look, this is going to be new, so that you understand what's going on, use the vernacular, right? But we always want to maintain that Latin is the mother tongue. And so it's very clear that the intention was always go back to Latin. Now, what happened was that we got so focused on vernacular, everyone forgot about Latin. To the point they were actually not teaching it in the seminary or anywhere else anymore. I remember when I was going through high school, I actually was kind of encouraging that many schools now are actually using Latin, providing Latin as a language. Because when I was going through high school, that wasn't an option. I think there were maybe in two high schools. I think it was Priory and maybe Chaminade that were actually having Latin. The girls' schools, I don't know if there were any at the time.
It wasn't allowed. You had to have 2 years of it.
Right. Well, what I'm saying is that like CBC and other, that wasn't even an option. Latin was not even offered.
But it was before that.
Before that.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. Well, sure.
All right. Yeah.
Because that's what you get in the liturgy, right? And so what happened then was you got this catch-22. Well, we're not learning Latin anymore. Well, why not? We're not using liturgy. Why are we losing liturgy? Because we're not teaching Latin anymore, right? And so you get this kind of circular logic happening, and I think now it's starting to be broken in some ways. So, I'll just tell you my personal experience when it came to the extraordinary form of the Mass, which is the Mass you'll see at places like Francis de Sales and at St. Luke, well, now
What
called
we
the
grew
Oratory.
up with.
The one prior to 1970, right? Or really 1963.
1965.
Yeah.
All right.
So when I first experienced, I was in seminary, right? I grew up in a Novus Ordo parish. Now, the pastor there, I think, was a little more traditional in his bent. So he wouldn't mind using incense and that kind of thing,
Where
too.
did you grow up?
Immaculate Heart of Mary in South City.
South City.
Yeah.
City.
So
Okay.
my pastor, from the time we moved into that parish when I was 2 until I was about 14 years old, was Father Richard Nelke. So
Any
Father,
relation to Father Nelke now?
there's a Father Nelke now.
Yeah. When he had
thought
he was
there
at
was.
Holy Trinity. Yeah. Yeah. There's I think.
He's
Maybe
the only
it's
Father
not.
Nelke I know.
Okay.
But he passed away in like 2008. So he's been, yeah. But I mean, he was the pastor there for a good while. And then he moved on to Ascension. We had a new pastor, and but he wouldn't necessarily do Latin because I think also too, nobody knew it,
And at
right?
one time you had to get special permission to have a Latin Mass, I believe.
Well, okay. So now, what do you mean by that, Dan? Because
Well, I thought you had to get permission from the bishop or the archbishop to do it in Latin.
no,
No? Okay.
the documents ever. Now, here's the thing.
That was the impression.
Here, well, maybe that was. Oh boy, here's the, I don't know what priests were saying at the time or what they were trying to.
So
Because
this was
sometimes,
the father.
well, yeah. So sometimes priests maybe use the archbishop, as a fall guy.
Okay. There was a bus coming along. They threw him under it.
Maybe I'm not saying that's the case here, or at least maybe the perception was that maybe we have to get permission. I don't know. What I can say though is that the documents are very clear. Now, to your point though, if the archbishop, right, who I pledge obedience to, comes and says, you know what, I'd really want to know if you're doing the Latin Mass, right?
And by Latin Mass, you're
Meaning a Novus Ordo.
Order.
So we'll
Thank
get that in a second.
Thank you.
That's a good
Okay.
distinction, Kathy. We'll get that in a second. So right now, I can go tomorrow here at St. Anne at the 8:15 Mass and celebrate that all night. Now, people may be like, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? What's going on? And rightly so, maybe, right? So I think also, too, when it comes to these things, there has to be some level of preparation for it, right?
Mhm.
To mean like, let's try to learn some of this. I think that's reasonable, right? And I don't think any priest would introduce that until they. Now, I know the candlelight we had, but my impression was that was more of a different animal.
Yeah, we used to have the candlelight mass, but it was done in English. It was a
in
regular
English.
mass,
Yeah.
just
It was
done in
English.
candlelight.
And that's the thing. I mean, that really is the Orate Caeli Mass. And the problem I had, and this is just maybe just because I wasn't learned enough. My understanding is that Mass traditionally has always been celebrated in Latin.
But it was traditionally said in the morning too, right?
Correct.
Yes.
During the sunrise, yeah.
Yes.
But then that changed over time within the monasteries themselves where it was formulated. So again, it's still kind of like where do we draw the line in ancient? I don't know.
Let's go
Right?
back to the first century.
Right, exactly. So yeah, I mean, there can be those what they call not necessarily innovations, but organic growth in those things, right? So there is talk about that. Now, so when it comes to Latin, yeah, there's nothing restricting anybody from using Latin in the Novus Ordo at all.
So it's basically up to you.
Correct.
Okay.
As it's up to the celebrant. Now, but again, I think there's prudent reason to say I shouldn't just like do that. Let's try to get some, involvement and get some understanding before we go there, right? But even like use of incense. So incense has always been part of the Mass from time immemorial, and really there's good theological reasons behind that. Namely, it represents our prayers going up to God, right? In the sweet aroma that's being offered to God the Father. It's always used in temple worship, right? As an offering, right? Incense was the highest offering you can give to God, right? Mostly because it was very costly, but that was used in that respect, right? So also, the incense in a way kind of also alludes to the mystery that's happening in the mass, right? So I think Bishop Barron put this actually very well. He said, you know, when the smoke kind of gets here, it kind of obfuscates things, right? That you can't necessarily see it clearly. And that's kind of the mystery of what's happening in the mass, that there's something happening here that we can't truly fully explain. And that's symbolized even further in the use of the incense, right? So there's many reasons behind that. But again, in the same way, the germ is very specific. Use any time, any mass, doesn't matter, right? If we want to use it every day,
But it
great.
was kind of pushed aside and not done.
Well, and I think, and
For a
here,
variety
well,
of
so
reasons.
and here's the thing. I think a lot of that depends on the quality of your incense. So I know growing up, boy, we had like sawdust. It was not. It was cheap stuff.
Yes.
It was like, you know, when it burned, it smelled of cedar, but by the time it was done, it really smelled like stuff you throw in vomit. Right? It was not very pleasing. I will say here, I mean, it seems like we have a pretty good mixture. And a lot of it depends on how you mix it. I mean, you can use cheap stuff. Maybe you can mix that in with some of the higher quality things, and maybe it has a good aroma, right? Some of that could be, some of that's kind of, you know, trial and error.
And it depends on the church and how it disseminates as
Mhm.
well.
Yeah.
Because here, there's such a wide expanse
Correct.
that
Kind of
unless
space.
you've got it building,
Right,
you're
right.
when you get toward the back, you could barely
Yep,
even tell
kind of
what's there.
space, right. Right. Yeah. So I mean, all those things, though. Yeah. I mean, so why were they put on the back burner? Again, I think that was just certain priests were like, well, you know, we're getting rid of this stuff. We're not doing this anymore. And
But
when
we
I was born, that's how it
should-
went.
We should be using incense during our holy days, right? During Christmas
I
and
mean,
the
well,
Christmas
well,
octave and
see, that's what,
Easter
well,
and the Easter octave.
that's kind of the thing, though. It's like it's not like required. So in other words, there are certain things that are what they call prescribed in the journal, right? So for instance,
Yeah.
a good example of that is homilies, right? Homilies are prescribed for solemnities. You have to do them, right? You can't not do a homily on a Sunday or a holy day of obligation or any solemnity, right? Not just holy day of obligation, but like presentation, right? That's a solemnity. Or St. Joseph, right? These days aren't necessarily holy days of obligation for us. Maybe somewhere else they are, but solemnities require a homily. Any other day, for certain days, like it says, like during Advent and Lent and feast days, it's very highly encouraged. Or there are masses where there's large gatherings. It's highly encouraged that you have a homily. Not required. Same thing when it comes to petitions, right? So you could have a what they call a missa simplex. So if I were celebrating Mass by myself, that looks a lot different than if I'm celebrating Mass on Sunday.
You don't give yourself a homily.
I do not give myself a
You
homily.
don't talk to yourself.
I do not do that. That'd be kind of crazy. I think it might be committed for something like that, right? But I mean, there's different kind of what they call progressive solemnity, right? That correspond to like what type of Mass you're celebrating. So to that point, should we use incense in solemnity? Well, I mean, it's reasonable to do that because that's the highest type of Mass you can celebrate is solemnity. So, all right, sure. Now, there are also practical issues with that too, right? So, for instance, do I have servers? You know, it helps to have servers when we have some of those things, right? It's not necessary to have servers, but it does help, right?
COVID taught us you don't have to.
Exactly, right. So a lot of those are there's always a theological reason and a practical reason behind these things, right? Like so, for instance, talking about incense, practically speaking, it was used a lot in the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance and other times.
Cover the smell.
To cover the smell,
The smell, yeah.
right? People were traveling; the hygiene wasn't as good as it
And
is
the
today.
gifts they brought.
Exactly right. And so, all right, we probably need to make this place smell a little better than it actually is. So incense, let's bring it out, right? And also with the Latin. I mean, Latin, there's a practical reason for using Latin too. That when you're talking about a universal church, if I'm here or in Singapore or in Australia or in Asia, it's going to be the same Mass because I can recognize it by the language being spoken. And it also differentiates between, let's say, our rite, R-I-T-E, and other rites, right? So if I go into a church and they're speaking Greek, okay, That's not Latin. No, maybe it's Catholic. I don't know. Hopefully, right? Especially after 1054, maybe, hopefully, right? But I can at least say, okay, at least I know what's going on here, right? So again, there's always a practical and a theological reason.
It is helpful when Latin is used for the people to know what is said,
Sure, sure.
and that's kind of
Yeah, and part of that too, I think, is based on getting it ready for Advent.
who wants to look? I don't
It's
know.
not mine.
It's not mine either. We don't
I
have
know
much.
it could be mine.
Unless I don't think it is. No.
Sounds like it's back.
Well, that's my car. It just beeped.
Stop.
Okay, good. All right.
Not mine?
Okay.
Stop, somebody's out there.
Okay, good. All right. We'll go again. Sorry, we had a little horn honking outside. We weren't really sure what that. Oh, there we go again. All right. I don't know.
There's a car out there. Lights on.
So, I'm sorry, I got lost on the question.
To have what the Latin means.
Yeah. So, yeah, part of that was kind of a thing. Like, I know coming here, I've been told that it was traditional here, especially during Advent and Lent, like Agnus Dei and the Sanctus usually is done here. It's Saint Anne.
Okay.
Right. So again, part of this maybe is a learning curve as far as, okay, what's been done at the two parishes, what can work, what can bend well. So we're still trying to kind of discern that and figure that out. And right now, when it comes to those things, I'm kind of more of a observe mode to see what kind of works as far as bringing the two communities together, right? And we're open to discussion and any input as far as that's concerned. But yeah, I mean, one thing that I did in my former parish, because we would have a Latin Novus Ordo about once a month. But before we did that, we took about 6 months and actually did a weekly Latin course that was just on the actual liturgy, meaning we would do practice the Mass parts. And I think what people that went to that realized was that there's not a lot that the laity say in Latin, and if they do, it's actually kind of repetitive. So like if I were to say Dominus Vobiscum,
Ecum Spiritu Tuo.
right? I mean, most people kind of can get that pretty easily, right? Or Amen. Now there are certain things that may be more essential, like Ecce Agnus Dei, Ecce qui tollit peccata mundi, Benedicta vos vocate sunt, right? So blessed, that, and that's just behold the Lamb of God, behold him takes away the sins of the world. Blessed are those called to the supper of the Lamb, right? Now in Latin, it would be a little different, right? Than which would be. It's so funny because now I'm from the other side. I don't really say as much. It's always funny how when you think about the Mass, you can always do it in the context of the Mass, but you can't do it outside the context of the Mass, right?
Yes.
So it's Lord, I'm not worthy to enter my roof. I only said word. Yeah. So Dominus non dignatus subtectum meum et sanabitur manum mea. So that's the Latin, but unless you knew that and practice it over and over again, you would never get it.
Well, Father, that's what I was going to bring up is that, our age group here, in general, we can respond almost automatically to some of those things.
Right.
But the younger generation, they don't.
Yeah.
And they're looking at, what are you talking about?
Right.
And I say the same thing to churches that I go to that have Spanish masses.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to have the translation there so people can appreciate and go along with what you're doing.
Yeah.
You don't learn anything by standing there saying,
right.
What are they talking
right.
about?
Right.
Yeah.
So I just throw that out. I say, it's
good.
to have the mix, but if we're going to pass it on,
right.
They've got to know what they're hearing.
Yeah. And I mean, the hand misses we actually had for that Mass, we did have the English translation there too. But I think it would be, to do that again, we probably want to get something developed as far as
even on Sunday.
I don't know. See, that's what I don't know.
He calls it the communion chant. I think he calls it after our song. It's in Latin.
Well, okay. Now here's the thing. Sometimes those things, when it comes and we talked about this a little bit when we had our discussion on liturgical music. We didn't really maybe go in depth on this, but we did talk about there are certain things that are intended for just like the cantor or the choir to sing, and nobody else, right? And sometimes those antiphons are those things, right?
But when they're in another language and you don't know what's being said.
Yeah. So I guess to that point, I mean, in some ways, there's a level of mystery involved with that we can kind of contemplate, right?
Every week.
Maybe. I don't. I mean, that's what I'm saying. I mean, I don't know. So, but we did kind of touch on those things a little bit. I didn't recognize that I don't know. Maybe I wasn't really paying attention. I got other things going on.
Well, you do, yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know. But I didn't ever notice it.
That might be something that needs to be explained to the general congregation.
Yeah, you're mixing a lot of people.
Yeah.
Because from Holy, like what you were saying, Mel, we came from Holy Trinity, and our holy masses on high holy days, if you'd like to use that term, were in English, Spanish, and French.
Oh.
But we had
like all at the same time.
No.
Well, like one reading would be in English and the response in something else, and then the next reading.
That's actually kind of interesting too.
Well, we had a huge African community.
Sure.
And we did some Swahili.
Well, I just say that because the German is actually very explicit when it comes to mixing languages, and it's actually explicitly forbidding it.
Okay.
Except for Latin.
Well, Latin's always a mother tongue.
Well, but if you do English and Latin, is that not mixing?
It is.
Okay.
And technically should not be done?
Technically, no. Now here's the other thing though too.
The question,
according to the germ. Now here's the thing. The question can be, and here's where it comes down when it comes to liturgical maxims. The thought was that whatever was ambiguous in the Novus Ordo, right? So this could be one of those ambiguities. Okay, we're allowed to use the vernacular, but Latin is the mother tongue. So we're trying to, if the intent here is we're trying to help people understand, well, it's not necessarily explicit in the Novus Ordo that you can actually mix the vernacular with Latin. But it does say you can't have multiple languages.
So having a bilingual Spanish and
English
mass,
I think you
shouldn't do that.
I think that's where you can say the ambiguity lies. So what it would say, what the maxim would be, which isn't explicit in the German, but I think most liturgists would say if it's not explicit or at least ambiguous, you refer back to the extraordinary form. And so in the extraordinary form, there were allowances to have the readings, let's say, in the vernacular and the rest of the Mass in Latin. Right?
It used to be done twice in Latin.
Right, and that also too was something was in the germ for the extraordinary form. And some priests, when you see some extraordinary form masses, if they have a homily, they will do it in both Latin and English. So yeah. So to that point, could there be ambiguity there? Well, maybe there is a little ambiguity there.
Yeah, but the times have changed too, because back then you didn't usually have that many people with different languages all in the same community.
Right. And that's the thing also too, like typically that could have been more development over time. It was more organic. But it was explicit. It was actually allowed within the general structure for the extraordinary form. Now, since summer of 2021, there's even kind of more what we call lacunas or gaps when it comes to those things, right? Because, for instance, well, now can you go refer back to the extraordinary form now that's been sort of, I don't like the word suppressed, but limited, maybe. Let's put it limited. That might be a better word. There's some questions about that because there's a lot of things that came out of the document, the bull. The motu proprio from 2021, when it talks about limitations to the extraordinary form. For instance, I have faculties to celebrate the extraordinary form because I was ordained prior to 2021, but I need the space to celebrate the extraordinary form. So what the document that came out was or at least I should say the dubia, the response to the dubia was very clear. It says you can't mix spaces, which made St. Luke kind of an interesting scenario because they were doing that at the time, but after all things new, they're now just the oratory. They're no longer St. Luke. right? They just do extraordinary form. That's it, because the document was clear. You can't have both forms of mass in the same sanctuary. Why? No, right? But like
the orientation of the altar.
well, but see, that's never really been a problem with the extraordinary form anyway. So maybe there was kind of this understanding of the architecture. I guess I don't know. That's still kind of a moot point, from the CDF or not the CD, like Astrid. So yeah, I mean it's kind of there's kind of like a lot of questions open when it comes to these things now, because like, well, now what do we refer to? Like, so where we see that explicitly, I think, is more like use of the bells, right? So there's nothing in the term of the Novus Ordo that says you should ring the bells during the epiclesis or the consecration.
It doesn't say how many times either.
Nope.
It says small bells may be used.
Maybe used.
Maybe
Right?
used.
Maybe used. Right? Yeah. That's always the wording. Maybe.
Maybe
Right?
used.
So in that ambiguity, you would say, okay, well, what have we done in extraordinary form? Oh, well, they did it this time. Oh, okay, great, cool. We'll just do that, right? So it's kind of an interesting time to be a liturgist these days. I feel bad for Father Nick Smith, who's a good friend of mine, because he's kind of dealing with a lot of these things now and kind of fielding these questions, and in some ways being the bad guy because he has to make some of these calls, right, on behalf of the Archbishop when it comes to these things. But I will say, I think the Archbishop did a very prudent and wise thing when it came to this kind of confusion. He basically made, because the document did kind of leave it up to the bishops to decide prudently how that would happen in their diocese. He basically said, wherever it's happening now, let's keep it. Wherever it's not happening, let's not go forward, right? I think that's pretty reasonable. And so I think that's pretty amicable as far as that's concerned, and prudent on his part. You know. But all this to say is that, you know, a lot of these things were allowances that were happening that came out of Vatican II. And, you know, then there's this kind of question of progressive solemnity, right? So would it be appropriate to, like, you know, do these things? Well, would I do it at a daily mass? And even the liturgy kind of has these things already ingrained into it, that you kind of know what kind of mass it is based on what's being done in the mass. So, like, for instance, when it comes to a feast, well, you know you're going to hear the Gloria on a feast day. And if it's a solemnity, you know you're going to probably hear another reading as well as the Creed, right? So in that respect, the Novus Ordo already has that progressive solemnity included into it. Whereas the extraordinary form wasn't as clear about that. Now, you still had different kind of hierarchies there too. So you had kind of, you know, you had the low mass, high mass, and like a missa cantata. But where that kind of was interesting is that, let's say you could have a low mass on Easter Sunday, right?
Yes.
So it's like, hey, it's Easter Sunday. Yeah, let's do a low mass.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah,
The 5 a.m. mass on
right,
Easter Sunday.
yeah, exactly. So in the Novus Ordo, I think it's more explicit. It's like, no, this is a big day. We need to kind of, you know, elevate that. Whereas in the extraordinary form, well, yeah, there's still kind of this level of like, well, you know, we're celebrating mass. That's all that really matters. Yeah, sure, right. So yeah, it's kind of, there's a lot of good, there's a lot of bad, a lot of good, a lot of interesting things happening in both forms. And I even understand kind of in some ways the logic of the Holy Father. I think in some ways it was maybe, I don't know if it was completely accurate, the reasoning behind the release, the promulgation of the document from 2021. Because what his rationale was, in history, there's never been two forms of the Latin Rite. And that's somewhat true. And I say somewhat because before, like, you know, the 8th century, there were different things happening because, well, we're over here in Germany and we're over here in Italy, and so we're doing different things. It's all the same structure. It's all the same structure, but like maybe one place the sign of peace here, and the sign of peace will be done over here in a different time, right? or maybe the offertory beat happened at a different time. What really started to bring that together was the expansion of the missionaries into these other pagan lands. So maybe Germany wasn't a good example, but like France, let's say, right? So France, these places where Christianity was still like, the cradle of Christianity, there were different things going on in different places. And so finally, when let's say you start having these itinerant orders that were going out and evangelizing and talking to these pagan cultures, the question is, what do you do for Mass? Well, what they did was they went to the Pope. What does the Pope do? He's the Holy Father. Whatever he does, we should be doing too, right? And at that point, it started to solidify. And once they started doing it, what the Pope did, everyone else started to follow suit. But that didn't happen until like the 7th, 8th century. And so from then on, yeah, you could say there was sort of a standardized rite, that maybe there is sort of a novelty in the 20th, from the 16th century on, or really, I should say from the 20th century on, where you had these two forms that were valid being used in the Latin Rite, where every other rite only had one way they were doing things, which is kind of true. But I think primarily what the Holy Father was focusing on was this, whether explicit or implicit belief by those who attend the extraordinary form, that the extraordinary form is the only valid form of the Mass. Now, maybe in some places of the world that is the thought. I in my experience here in St. Louis, I don't think many people that attend the extraordinary form believe that, or if they did believe, they weren't explicit about it. But apparently, a lot of this came from internet, people, and you can always trust what you read on the internet, right? So, which is why I think kind of brought the Holy Father to kind of look at this and say, well, maybe we need to limit this. Because I think in the same way, a very reverently celebrated Novus Ordo has the same effect in some ways of the extraordinary form, if not more so. I just think there's kind of different approaches in both those forms, right? Both good, both valid, right? Which is why I think it was always kind of wise, especially from Benedict XVI, to have kind of this like preference, whatever you feel comfortable with, do. If you feel at home in the extraordinary form, great. If you're at home in the Novus Ordo, great, right? I think the frustrating thing that I know a lot of my brother priests, and I think a lot of other faithfuls was that even though a lot of maybe the abuses were addressed in the document on the extraordinary form, not a lot was addressed on the abuses of the Novus Ordo. And unfortunately, I don't think we have to look very far, even within our own diocese, I'm sorry to say, to see some of that abuse. Where you have priests, whether they should know better or not, that's up to between them and God. I'm not going to judge anyone as far as that's concerned. But you have priests in our archdiocese who don't say the black and do the red, which is the most fundamental thing a priest really needs to do, right? I mean, that's all you have to do.
I'm going to omit this.
Yes, yeah, right, yeah. Or change it. I mean, it's like, well,
yes.
Okay, I mean, again, as a matter of fact, I had in my former parish, a teacher asked me. They weren't parishioners at our parish, but they went to another parish, and the teacher asked me, Father, okay, what needs to be said for it to be valid? And I was like, well, a reading has to be read, meaning something from Scripture, whether preferably gospel, but some reading, and the words, "This is my body and this is my blood," as long as it's a valid matter. Right? So as long as a validly ordained priest says, "This is my body, this is my blood," with valid matter, it's a Mass. Everything else lead up to that, well, hey, they can make it up, I guess, as they go along. But that's all that basically essentially needs to be done.
They can change the bread from the host, the typical host that we use, which some years ago we were up in the Northeast visiting friends, and they tended to use regular bread. It started out as regular bread.
You mean leavened bread, like Wonder Bread or something?
No, it
or?
wasn't Wonder Bread. It was
unleavened
bread, but it was sometimes it had cinnamon in it. Sometimes it didn't. But it was a regular Catholic church.
Yeah.
This goes back probably 30 years.
Yeah.
So things were a little, even though it was the northeast part of the country, it's kind of the Wild West.
Sure, sure, yeah. Boy, well, I mean,
And I'm
Valid
sure that was
nonetheless.
a parish
Yeah.
thing.
so I would say this, Dan, as long as it was unleavened bread, unleavened wheat bread at the root, right? So whether it had sugar sprinkled on it or cinnamon sprinkled on it or not, okay, as long as it was unleavened wheat bread and it was pure grape wine. So
I don't know about the wine.
Okay, all right.
I don't know about that.
So, and that's actually a good factor too, because the wine and the body and the blood need to be consecrated validly. So let's say the body's consecrated validly and the blood is not. It's not a valid mass, right? Now,
In the person's eyes that doesn't think it's valid.
what do you mean by that? No,
If I'm a parishioner and I don't know the difference,
that's the difference. So if you were to receive in that case, in that sense, right, not knowing this, you would still you're still fine. You're fine. You're okay. The sin is not on you, it's on that priest, right? And so because the priest should know better. And I think that's kind of what was kind of disappointing with this document that came out was that was never really addressed, right? And so that's unfortunate because if the Novus Ordo is the one that's being, and now the Novus Ordo is being celebrated much more in the extraordinary form, why wouldn't you? Just to bring that unity, if anything else, right? And I say all this in the utmost respect because I love Francis. I think sometimes he gets a bad rap as far as what he says because he does say a lot of things off the cuff. That's very true. But I always think it's important to make a distinction between what he says as reporters on an airplane and what he says ex cathedra. Because everything he said ex cathedra is completely in line with the Catholic Church teaching as the Pope and to be taken validly. Right? We always need to put that in perspective. Right? Because I think sometimes people critique him for what he says off the cuff, and rightly so. That's fine. You can do that. But you can't critique him for his role as the Holy Father, unless he does something that is explicitly against that role as the Holy Father, which he hasn't. Right? And we trust because he's a guided by the Holy Spirit, he won't. Right? So I say all that just to kind of, when we talk about these things when it comes to liturgy, tradition, we always have to take that in consideration and in context with what the church allows and what the church desires. But to go back to your original question, I think this all kind of comes down to what the focus was compared to what was actually written. And I think we do that a lot. Like even a great example of that, I think, is just this Fiducia Supplicans that just came out recently. I know we talked about this in other sessions before, but that's the document that talks about blessing.
Yeah.
Right? People were getting so hung up on this word couple. And it's like, now even though the CDF has clarified that sense, I think even going back to the L'Amoris Laetitia, right? So there's, if you read it, it's an amazing document. It's like, just makes sense. There's one footnote that people were focusing on where it was kind of ambiguous. I think that's a fair critique. But you also have to look at that in context with what the church teaches. So do you guys know what I'm talking about when I say that? You guys know exactly? Okay.
I'm way behind all you guys.
There you go. Okay, all right, good. Yeah. So Amoris Laetitia, Mel, came out shortly after the Holy Father was elevated. And it was kind of a document that was talking about the family. And if you read it, it's a beautiful exhortation about the sacrament of marriage and what that means and the goods of it and everything else. In line with other popes, Casti Connubii and other things have been written by other popes when it comes to marriage. Wonderful. There was a footnote, not even the main body, a footnote, where the Holy Father talks about irregular marriages. Do you know what I mean by that? Yeah. Okay. So for those who maybe don't know, when we say the word irregular marriage, what we mean is those that are not married within the sacrament of marriage. Okay. Not and haven't been properly dispensed, whatever. basically legit. What we're basically talking about is someone that's not necessarily actually married. That's kind of what it comes down to, right?
It's a marriage, not a civil union.
Well, yeah. So here's the thing, though. We have to be very careful when we use the word marriage, because okay, boy, this could be a whole other
Get the
conversation.
shovel out because you're gonna.
No, this is good.
You
This
didn't
is good.
even get to
This could
chant
be
yet.
this could be a friend's food faith all itself. Okay, so when I talk about the sacrament of marriage, right? That's when I have, let's say, a Catholic couple that comes to me. That's what we're shooting for, is a sacrament. Now, if we have, let's say, two atheists that never been baptized, don't believe in the faith, they go down to the justice of the peace and they get married. Is that a marriage?
In the eyes of the
In the
state,
eyes of the
yes.
state, yes. Not in the eyes of the church.
Yes.
But if
In
they
the eyes of
belong
the
to
church, okay,
why do
now
they care?
here's the thing: it's not a sacrament, but it is a marriage,
Oh, okay.
even in the eyes of the church. Right? It may be a natural marriage, but it's a marriage, right? There's a love. So, in order to make a marriage, there has to be three things: capability, meaning I know what I'm doing. I'm of a sound mind and will. I know what I'm saying yes to. Consent, meaning I'm actually giving rights to my body to this other person. And context, meaning I'm doing it in a way that I understand that's appropriate and right. Okay? All three things need to be present for you. Valid, meaning true marriage, right? For Catholics, we understand that capability is going through the proper preparation, understanding what rights of marriage, what the goods of marriage are, that there's no defect of mind or will that's keeping you from doing that. Consent is the marriage vow, the form of the sacrament, the marriage vows. And that's done in the context of being witnessed by the church. So for Catholics, that is marriage. Nothing other than that, right? Everyone else, do whatever you want to do. If you're a Lutheran, whatever works for you works for you. We even still recognize it as a sacrament of marriage. Even when we're Lutherans, they're baptized, right? Baptism gives the sacramentality. So when I have a couple, let's say they're not, one's Catholic, one's not. Well, the Catholic party has the obligation to fulfill these requirements for it to be a valid, meaning true marriage, not just legal, not just sacramental, an actual marriage, right? So anything outside of that will be considered irregular. Okay, so if a Catholic and let's say an atheist or a Jewish person or whatever, they go get married in the justice of the peace. Well, now they can be dispensed from that form, meaning they can come to me and say, Father, you know what? My spouse, they don't believe in the faith, they don't believe in the Trinity, but there'd be hostility if we were to get married in the church. Great, dispensed. Do whatever you need to do, right? That's a thing, right? And we would consider it to be a valid marriage, right? Cool. When you don't do that, it's invalid. It's irregular, right? So we're talking about those type of situations. So, or let's say you get divorced, you don't get annulment, they get married to somebody else. And let's say you have kids, right, with that person, or you're bringing kids into the marriage, from both parties. What the Holy Father wrote in Amoris Laetitia was that, maybe it could be a valid reason to share a bed or a room, even though you're not validly married, for the good of the family and the good of the children, it may be proper, not valid, proper, to share a bed. Now, what the Holy Father doesn't say, though, is it's good and moral to engage with your wife in that state, or this woman in that state, or that man in that state. But for the good of the family, maybe that'd be a good thing to do, right? Because we have to take that and understand what the church teaches. That, yeah, there could be examples and situations where, you know what, Father, we have to live in the same house, or we have to maybe share the same bed. The church recognizes maybe legitimate reasons for that, right? Very few and far between, but maybe there are legitimate reasons. And so for that, those matters, we still have to understand, though, you're not married, and any sexual act within that, outside of that bond, is immoral. And so maybe it's going to be much more difficult for you to maintain that chastity, and if you're struggling, we have a great sacrament for that too, right? that can help you with that as well. And you should talk to the priest and try to find a way forward that's beneficial, that actually upholding your dignity as a human person and your moral life. Maybe a lot of work, but I would hope if you really love this person, it'd be worth it, right? Again, that's what the church teaches. That's how we have to look at those things that the Holy Father even said, even within those documents, right? And it was clarified even later that, yeah, that's what I meant. Sure, because that's what the church teaches. You can't teach anything other than what the church teaches, right? To that same point, I think a lot of these things that are coming out with fiducia supplicans, we also have to look into what the church teaches. And when it comes to blessings, whether you're in a group or individually, the point of a blessing is to receive deeper grace in the sacraments. Sacramentals are meant to lead to the sacraments, right? So a blessing is meant for you to receive a deeper grace in the sacraments you receive. So I made this distinction, I think, in our last discussion, we brought this up, was before this even came out. If I had, let's say, two men that came to me and say, Father, we are living in a civil union. Now we're doing this because, well, you know what, we want to share benefits. He has some health problems, but also so I can see him in the hospital if he gets sick, because otherwise they won't let us in. We're trying to maintain chastity, right? We're living in separate beds, we're living in separate rooms in our house. We understand what the church teaches, and we understand that, and we agree with it. Can we have a blessing to help us do better in that? Yeah, sure. Let's do it, right? That's much different than, Father, we're in civil union. We don't care what the church teaches. We want you to bless us. No, right? Right. So the context and the intention matters. Now it's been brought up like, what won't they lie to you? Well, that's not on me.
That's on them.
That's on them. You know, I'm not blessing their marriage regardless. I'm not blessing them as a couple. I'm blessing them as individuals in this group of two, right?
And that's the key. You're not performing a ceremony and blessing the marriage. You're blessing the people. You could bless the pets.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You could bless a car.
Well,
you could bless a house.
And at this point, I think, and that's the other thing why I think the Holy Father's getting a bad rap on this, because if you actually read that document, it goes to great lengths even to make distinctions between what the circumstances even are.
Mm-hmm.
And it's available.
Yeah, and that's like you
that
to the point
doesn't
like you can't be wearing tuxes,
soundbite.
right? Yeah, right. I mean, to the point where you can't be wearing tuxes or like dress if you're going to a wedding.
Yes.
And it's like, well, all right, that's pretty clear to me. So I think a lot of this is just, unfortunately, I think politically charged. And that's unfortunate that people of faith are letting that.
Read the document.
Yeah.
Inform
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah. And even some of the things that are coming out of it. I mean, I don't think the media really helps a lot of these things.
Well, the media's headline was one thing, and they included the document. And if you read the document,
Right.
it was
It doesn't make sense
clear.
to hell, yeah.
Right.
Well, even some things, I know there was a big headline coming out with probably the African bishops. You know, the headlines say that they've rejected the document. Well, they can't, first off. But I mean, but then we start looking into it, it's like they're not saying they reject it. They're calling for people to be their priests to be prudent in how they do it, which is
Completely different.
sure good. Yes, exactly. That's what we all want for this, right? It's very frustrating. It's very frustrating. Yeah.
And now the second part of your question, chant.
Chant, yeah. So
Chant.
again, you know, chant is one of those things that have always been upheld, you know, in the church that from the time of Gregory the Great on, you know, Gregorian chant, right? That comes from Saint Gregory. So again, back to this whole notion of when the people started being evangelized, going out on missionary work. Well, Gregory happened to be the Pope, and he really developed this chant that was used in liturgy. And so from then on, it's always been used, right? But also, I think the other thing about chant is that, you know, from a practical standpoint, it's easy to do.
A simple chant.
Yeah, yeah. Not only people, I mean,
Yeah.
so you get like Polyphony, right? I mean, sure, okay, that can be a little more difficult, but simple
It
chant
is,
is
yeah.
not
Yeah.
very hard to do.
If you have the notes in front of you and the one that you're supposed
Right.
to hold is bold,
Right.
it's simple.
I mean, even the point too, where if you start and end on the right note, it's very simple.
It is.
everything in the middle,
Yeah,
do whatever you
it's
want.
the
You know,
same.
yeah, all right, yeah.
Are the same.
Yeah, right. Um, but more probably, more theologically speaking, though, and this is really goes back to Augustine. Augustine talks about those who sing pray twice, right? That we're engaging with the angelic choirs, and we actually use our gift of our voice to praise God, right? Whether you can sing well or not. Now you could say, well, maybe I don't sing well, and okay.
That's where the people who listen pray twice.
Yeah, right.
One that they hear something different than what they're actually hearing.
Sure, yeah, So yeah, so I mean, all these things to say that, but again, even then, chant is an option, right? Because, and again, even at that point, the focus was not so much on chant and these organ and these other, things have been traditionally used in churches for, centuries, but when they say about anything else that is dignified for the space, well, what does that mean, right? I mean, you can even go as far as saying like, well, you look back in the Old Testament, cymbals and bagpipes and flutes, sure, right? String instruments, lutes, harps, yeah, cool, right? Those are all liturgical, and yeah, they're all biblical, so awesome. Then you start getting to things like drums, maybe. Piano. Well, I mean, pianos weren't around back in the that time, but maybe, So that's why you start getting these other things like, okay, what about a bass guitar? well, I mean, now we're starting to get into the ambiguous territory, right? And again, the other thing we have to take into consideration when it comes to these things is the space, right? So what is the space designed for? And I think it's kind of funny, like, I think even this church here, it's not necessarily designed for amplification, right? And so we have microphones because people can't hear and help them, sure, but it wasn't designed for that. And also, like, where you put these instruments is also dependent on the space. So there's a reason we have choir lofts, because the design is such that where that can be the best place to hear these things, right? So put them other places, even though that may be, people can see them, okay, but, audibly, that may not be the best place to be, right? And all that needs to be discerned and taken into account when you talk about music in the liturgy, right? Whether it be chant or anything else. So, yeah, so I think there's a lot, again, that comes on the focus on, well, what is the actual, the tradition that was upheld in these documents, and what has been the allowance? And there's more looking at the allowance there has been on what's been upheld. Now, to that point, though, I mean, just a couple of years, 2020, which is funny because I didn't even know this document came out, but the bishops of the United States put a document out when it came to liturgical music. And what's interesting is they were specifically looking at different hymns and songs. And what's really fascinating is they were naming names, explicitly songs that shouldn't be used because of the theological points they're trying to make that are not in line with Catholic teaching. Not necessarily the musicianship or the actual technical ability. It's really more the theological context behind it. So I thought that was actually very interesting that they did that, because boy, you can maybe make some enemies by naming names in that respect. Yeah. And there's some songs on there that, like, I grew up with, and it's like, I didn't necessarily mind them, but then it's like, oh, I kind of see what we're getting at here, right? So, yeah, I think that's, so up until then, though, I think there was a lot of open questions when it comes to these things, Dan, which is why I think you started to see more of a influx of different things in the liturgy when it came